Good evening, St. John's. Welcome to session 4 on our summer Protestant Reformation Church History series. If you don't know me, my name is Danielle Kuhn. I'm the Director of Faith Formation at St. John the Baptist. Just a disclaimer, I am not a history professor. I don't have a PhD in this subject, and I think I need to be responsible and say that I am by no means an expert or a historian. That being said, I do love talking about this time in history, and especially the theology and ideologies around it. So, that being said, let's get into it. Just to recap, last week we talked about humanism, the ideological movement that really pushed for education of the self, and had a focus on the idea that with greater knowledge, with greater education, and especially self-knowledge, it can help you grow closer to God. So it's kind of this push for, hey, humans themselves can do human things to help them get closer to God on their own. Kind of not saying that they can reach and comprehend God completely by themselves, but if we educate ourselves, we can understand God more. Second, we discussed scholasticism with its methodical examination of different theological issues, and then also the movement against scholasticism that saw it as too much of making God into a puzzle to be solved. And then third, we talked about medieval piety practices, especially this idea that the lay people were really looking for different concrete things that they could do to sanctify themselves. There was really a display of people wanting to feel like they had some kind of control over their own salvation, like they could know for sure if they were saved or not. This week, we are finally going to be getting into more of what people actually think of when they think of the Protestant Reformation, and that means Luther. He's kind of the match that lights everything on fire. He's not the only reformer, but he is the first that really begins what we think of as the Protestant Reformation. I do want to say real quick that, again, I'll be pausing to take my water breaks for questions. If there are any, you can comment and leave a question. Otherwise, too, you can email me any questions at this email below, daniellec@johnthebaptist.org, if you have any questions afterwards or in general. Okay. So, Luther. Luther was born on November 10th, 1483 in Eisleben in Saxony, and I will probably mispronounce all of these German names, so fair warning. The printing press did exist at this time, and as a boy, he grew up with a lot of printed texts. He was very well educated. He had a lot of books growing up. He attended the University of Erfurt, and he first aimed for a career in law. He was trained in scholasticism. In fact, he already had all these law books bought for him, that his father had bought him all these law books, the expensive kind. He was all set to go to law school when Luther was 21 years old in 1505. He's out in the middle of a thunderstorm. Just walking out in the middle of a thunderstorm, and he's terrified. Lightning is striking all around, and with fear in his heart, he does a very common piety practice for that time. He tries to make a bargain with a saint. He yells out, "Help me, Saint Anne." Saint Anne is the mother of Mary. "Help me, Saint Anne, and I will become a monk." This was a very common thing to do during the medieval times, Renaissance times. There was this notion that, like a king with a court, you wouldn't go directly to the king. You'd kind of have a patron who would lobby your case for the king. There was a lot of thinking of the saints in this way. You don't want to go directly to God because he's too mighty and powerful, so you're going to pick a patron saint, and they're going to kind of lobby for you. So Luther yelling out for Saint Anne, he wants to make her his patron and lobby for his life to God in heaven, and in return, he will become a monk. Oh, how ironic that approximately 15 years after this, he will have completely antithetical views to the ones that he held when he shouted out for a saint's intercession. But he does make good on his promise when he says, "I will become a monk if you keep me safe, St. Anne." He enters Augustinian monastery, and he studies to become a monk, and he's accepted. And this period in Luther's life, from 1505 to like 1515, before he posts his 95 Theses in 1517, I think is so important to look at and ruminate on a bit and understand, to know why Luther had the ideas that he had and how he came to those conclusions, and more importantly, what motivated him to be looking for those conclusions. So Luther as a monk he begins to become plagued by scrupulosity. Now, it's normal in religious life and in all life, if you are pursuing a path to holiness and trying to grow closer to Christ, you'll have a time period where you start to realize all the sin in your life. God, as you grow closer to him, it's like when you're driving towards the sun, and when you're driving straight towards the sun, you can see all the crud on your windshield. Luther had that going on. He could just see all the different aspects of sin in his life, and it tormented him. He was extremely focused on it, to the point where he would go to confession every single day, describing every sin of his in detail. He wasn't just worried about sins themselves. He got really worried about, did I confess them correctly? Do I need to make a new confession? Did I sin during my confession of my sins? To the point where his confessor at one point said, "Get out of here and don't come back until you actually have something legitimate to go to confession about." Because you do not want to be overly scrupulous. That's not good for the soul. That doesn't actually lead one to God. Luther really struggled with his humanity. And I think this is a really common thing. This is a very common experience. You're growing closer to God. The more you're aware of God's goodness and God's beauty, the more painfully you're aware of your own littleness and all the different ways that you fail. And that can be such a blow to one's ego when you start to realize, I'm not as great as I thought I was. And you have to deal with that knowledge. I've definitely been there, where you start to realize all your faults, and it's difficult. So Luther was in the midst of this and really, really struggling with it. When we realize our own sin, it's at that point that we're called to abandon ourselves to God's divine mercy and trust and surrender to him, accepting our weaknesses even as we continue to strive for holiness and perfection. I said last class, Catholicism is characterized by this tension, and this is part of the tension. This acknowledging that we aren't ever going to be perfect and accepting the fact that we have so much sin in our life, but not letting that prevent us from striving for God and striving for holiness and continuing. So Luther very much struggled with this. Despite how this seems to be a focus on God, it seems to be a focus on goodness and trying to be holy, scrupulosity is actually an extreme focus on oneself. It's not contemplating enough God's divine mercy, but instead being, I am so weak, I am so incapable, I can't possibly be holy, God can't possibly love me, I can't possibly be saved. It's really characterized by a lot of thoughts about yourself, which is why it's a very negative thing. A confessor also once said to Luther, as Luther fretted about how God was going to judge him and have wrath for him because of all of his sins, he said, quote, "You are a fool. God is not angry with you. but you are angry with God. And I think that's a very telling thing. It weighed on Luther a lot too. And he struggled with, how do I not be angry at God for the fact that I'm so weak and incapable? St. Augustine has a really beautiful quote that I love that kind of speaks to this issue, where he says, "Beware of despairing in yourself. You are commanded to place your trust in God, not in yourself." This is important to know about Luther because it really speaks to how later on he wants to get away from any focus on human works, on human action. He doesn't want to have his actions have any real theological significance. He wants to ease his mind in a way. So salvation and whether he was saved and how could he possibly be good enough to be saved when he was so sinful became sort of an obsession of Luther's. Eventually, his spiritual director, in an effort to get Luther to think about something else, kind of get him out of his own head, sends him off to go get his doctorate in biblical studies. And get his doctorate, Luther does. He voraciously tackles all of his different classes and studying the Bible. It becomes something he's really, really passionate about. And eventually, from Luther's intense study of Scripture, he would develop an interpretation of the Bible and salvation that would allow him to get out of this torment that he was stuck in with being so in despair about his own weakness and inability and the fact that he sinned still. Later on, this background would color his passion when he spoke about justification through works and how much he wanted to distance himself from the idea of justification through works. It colors when he argues that God saves by faith alone, and that how well you act isn't part of the equation. Not that there's an equation. We really want to get away from any language that involves equations. But you can see why this is an important piece of information to know about Luther, to understand the reformer that he was and what motivated him. Throughout his life, and even after he broke from the church and was a fully fledged rebellious reformer, he was really continually plagued by these deep inner spiritual struggles. He wrote a lot about devils and demons tormenting him in his room at night and appearing to him, and he never really achieved spiritual peace in that way. He always felt really plagued by demons. Okay, so Luther develops this new interpretation of salvation. His greatest breakthrough comes from his interpretation of Romans 1:17, which says, quote, "Moreover, the righteous shall live through faith." And I will throw up something that he wrote about that. Luther said, he wrote, "Then I began to understand that the righteousness of God is that by which the righteous live by a gift of God, that is, by faith, and that the gospel reveals that a merciful God justifies us by faith with a passive righteousness. This made me feel as if I had been born again and passed through open doors into paradise itself. All of Scripture appeared different to me now, and I then began to love that term I used to hate, the righteousness of God, as the sweetest of all. Thus, Paul truly became my gateway to paradise." This turning point that he had with Paul is what Luther's so-called tower experience is. When he really switches and his ideas on salvation become that salvation is something passively laid upon us by Christ through our own faith. It is kind of it covers us like snow almost. We'll talk more about that metaphor later, but and gradually, with this understanding of humanity having a more passive role in righteousness, righteousness being a gift that God sort of plops on top of people, not something that humans grow in or increase in or is at all connected with acts that they do. It's all God kind of puts it on the humans. And from this, he develops a new way of interpreting the Bible and simultaneously a new theology of salvation. He felt that the key to the entire Bible was Paul's epistles. Like he says, Paul was the key to paradise. He loves Paul, hates James. He formulated a theology in which salvation became a question of pure faith rather than behavior, which again is great for him because it really relieves the scrupulosity that he was tormented with. He was tormented by the fact that his behavior could not perfectly in his mind align with what he thought was required for salvation, and he's tormented by that. So this new theology of salvation really relieves any of that tension because your behavior has no merit. By faith alone, you have that righteousness put on you. He advocated for a plain sense of Scripture, and eventually, so Luther would not have agreed with some, definitely would not have agreed with some more 20th century, intensely literal interpretations of the Bible, but he did want a more plain sense of Scripture. So he wanted to kind of distance himself from the scholastics that had really deep, intense, breaking everything down with 5 different layers interpretations and commentaries on scriptures. He wanted to get away from that. And he eventually, not off the bat, does he find himself supporting this belief, but eventually he does get to the supporting of Scripture alone as the basis for all theological ideas. Okay. So, do you remember Bishop Albert? Albert of Mainz, the one who was really corrupt and abusing indulgences to pay off his corrupt debts? Well, he is alive, and the bishop over the area where Luther is alive. You can see why Luther would get incensed. Having one of the most corrupt bishops of the time as a very close bishop to you who's already feeling kind of angsty and uppity against the church really drew a lot of ire from Luther, especially because Albert had this one priest below him, Johann Tetzel, going around and preaching, trying to get people to donate for indulgences so he could pay off his corrupt debts. And Luther becomes enraged at this Tetzel guy. Understandably so. He was really taking advantage of the people. There's a quote from Tetzel. He was going around preaching, and he says, "All of you, run for the salvation of your souls. Listen now, God and St. Peter call you. Consider the salvation of your souls and those of your loved ones departed." So see, he's really playing on their hearts, like, consider your dead relatives and those you loved who are gone. Remember that you are able to release them, for as soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. Will you not then, for a quarter of a florin, receive these letters of indulgence through which you are able to lead a divine and immortal soul into the fatherland of paradise? So, this really makes Luther mad, and it should, because this was a flagrant and terrible abuse of indulgences, and really a huge misrepresentation of what an indulgence is. As we talked about 2 classes ago, Tetzel's words on indulgences do not convey what an indulgence actually is. An indulgence cannot be bought. You cannot sell indulgences. So to kind of really deliberately mislead all these people so that they donate money to you so that you can pay off your debt, so that you can pay back the people who you bribed so that you could be the Bishop of Mainz was really, really scummy. It was a terrible thing. So Luther decides in 1517, I have had it. This Tetzel guy is the worst. I need to do something. And this is where his 95 Theses come in. Coming up to All Souls Day, and Luther knew that on All Souls Day, all the people would be clamoring for indulgences because that's the time that they're thinking about their dead relatives, and they feel really guilt-tripped into thinking, oh, I really need to donate so I can save my aunt and uncle who died last year. If I don't donate, then it's basically like I don't love them. He knows that's coming up, so he really wants to make this time of year the time where he calls attention to the fact that this is an abuse of indulgences and Bishop Albert is the worst. So he draws up these theses meant to be for debate in Latin, and there's 95 of them, kind of like 95 different conclusions. Theses is like a conclusion. It means a statement of a main point or idea, and Luther has 95 of these. There's kind of a misnomer that these were, there's a story that they were nailed on the door of the cathedral. Most historians don't think that's actually true because it wouldn't make any sense for him to do so. He wrote them in Latin, and they were meant for academic debate, so pretty dry language. Not many people could read Latin, not many common people. If you were just the everyday Joe going to the cathedral and you saw that nailed to the door, you might just rip it off and be like, some random person nailed a bunch of gibberish to my church door, I don't care, and continue walking in. So did he actually do that? Probably not. What he definitely did do was send a bunch of letters containing his 95 Theses to the priests and bishops and theologians of the area. And that makes a lot more sense because the purpose of the 95 Theses was to kind of get a discussion going and also to jab some people. He had some harsh words for Bishop Albert, and even some threatening words for him. So, and he does this on October 31st of 1517. The 95 Theses go out. They were intended to be for academic debate, so again, they were kind of dry, he's trained in scholasticism, so it's very meticulous language. He's trying to very clearly make his points. But they spread throughout Germany in weeks and Europe in months, which was a big surprise to Luther at the time. He did not think that would happen. But we have the printing press at this time. It was a lot easier for these types of things to be proliferated. So before he knows it, his 95 Theses is all over Europe. And that really speaks to the fact that it was very much hitting a raw nerve with the laity. This was boring language. This was nothing eloquent or fluent or artsy or captivating. It was dull. And still, people were passing it around like it was the most captivating thing they'd read the past year. Because it was for them, because it was touching a very sensitive subject. People were reading this and being like, yeah, why are they doing these things? Why are there absentee bishops? There still is corruption within rulers making bishops, deciding who's going to be bishops. And there still is simony. And there still is this abuse of indulgences everywhere. I'm mad about this. I am mad about this. He really kind of gave a voice to the people in this way. At first, Luther is just meaning to instigate reform and discussion. But his popularity is growing so fast, especially for that time period, to have that kind of circulation and growth in popularity within a year was crazy fast for that time period. And as he grows in popularity, he kind of grows in the radicalness and confidence he has in his beliefs. Like when he has all these people behind him being like, yeah, I totally agree with you. He kind of is like, yeah, I am right, aren't I? Definitely. I'm going to take this a little bit further. So he definitely got more confident. And by 1518, October of 1518, he was saying the Pope was the Antichrist, or at least an apostle of the Antichrist. So he really radicalized his beliefs kind of quickly, because in 1517, in October, when he first released his 95 Theses, he was still using language concerning the Pope as, oh, we need to always respect him, we need to make sure we're not doing actions that make the Pope look bad. 1 year later, he's like, Pope is the Antichrist. Pope is the Antichrist. So it happened kind of quickly. At this point, he's called before an Augustinian council to clarify kind of his positions. And this is called the Heidelberg Disputations. The leaders, his superiors in the Augustinian order that he was a part of, want him to clarify his points. Basically, they want him to say, look, are you a heretic or are you not a heretic? Could you let us know? Because if you are a heretic, we'll probably need to get rid of you. So please just state it clearly. Luther, there is no benefit for Luther stating clearly that he is a heretic, even though he probably realizes at this time that his beliefs are pretty heretical and he's going in that direction. So he does not clarify. He uses his scholarly training, and especially his training in law, to kind of speak in circles around where he stands on topics, and he doesn't really clarify anything. However, his Augustinian superiors kind of see the writing on the wall. They're like, well, you didn't definitively say you weren't a heretic, so... And they quietly release him from the order. They want to have him kind of out of their Augustinian ranks before he gets declared a heretic, because it's going to be bad press for them if one of their members is excommunicated by the Pope. So they see the writing on the wall and they're like, you can go now. Next, he gets called into these debates with a man named Johann Eck, who's a German Catholic theologian. And Eck prepared for these debates, and he was coming for Luther. He was not going to let it be like the Heidelberg Disputations, where Luther kind of got off with no one being able to definitively say he was a heretic. Eck wants him to be able to be definitively declared a heretic so we can excommunicate him, so the church can kind of get rid of him. Because when the church excommunicates someone and declares them a heretic, secular rulers will go after that heretic and usually burn them at the stake. The church doesn't have the authority to do that. The church never put anyone to death explicitly, but whenever the church declared someone was a heretic, rulers would go after that person and usually burn them. So Eck wants him to be definitively declared a heretic so he can kind of get him dealt with, and his ideas will stop being circulated. And Eck succeeds very much so at forcing Luther to have to clearly state his position on a lot of heretical beliefs. So at these debates, Luther ends up making it quite clear that he was promoting teachers that meant a split from the church. He directly says that the church hierarchy is evil and unnecessary. He declares sola scriptura, so that's the belief that scripture alone is the only authority that can be used for grounding theological beliefs. He also ends up saying that any Christian with a Bible has greater authority than the Pope or a council. Any Christian with knowledge of the Bible has more authority than the Pope or any council. So Luther comes out very obviously looking heretical. There was no mistaking his intentions at that point. Eck had really pushed him into different corners and having to state his actual stances on things. So any illusion that Luther was still just trying to reform indulgences or clerical corruption was gone. We're like, this isn't just about reforming really negative aspects of the church. Now we realize that you are very much trying to start a movement that completely splits from the church. So, Pope Leo X does then declare Luther to be a heretic. This takes a long time, though. The debates with Johann Eck and Luther are happening in Germany. So reports of the debates have to come all the way to Rome. Then the papal bull declaring excommunication has to go all the way back to Germany. There's a lot of interim time in between which Luther has some time to make arrangements so that he doesn't get burned at the stake or killed for being a heretic. So he starts trying to figure out his strategy for avoiding what most people saw as his coming doom, now that he was known as an obvious heretic and that he was wanting to split from the church. When he's declared, when he's excommunicated from the church, that makes him a fugitive because all the Catholic rulers, nobles and rulers will want to go after him and put him to death because they want to be on the Pope's side, on the Pope's good side. So he has to find someone who's going to shelter him. In this excommunication bull, 41 of Luther's 95 theses were declared to be heretical, 41 of them. And he's told to recant them, which he doesn't. I want to note here that this means that 54 of his theses were legitimate and on point. Yes, 41 were declared heretical. 54 of them, though, were sound. I was told one time of a family who burned every Halloween Luther's 95 Theses. I understand the sentiment, but also 54 of those 95 Theses we're burning are legitimate points. And Luther himself was not a totally terrible guy, so I don't know. I'd be hesitant maybe to burn any 95 Theses. Just give it a thought before you throw any in the fire. Anyways, so Luther would have quickly gone down the path of so many other heretics, but he had on his side Frederick the Wise. Now, Frederick the Wise is kind of a funny guy. Before all this happened, he had a huge collection of relics. He was super into saint relics, and he made a lot of money off of them because he would make people pay to see them, and so he hated other people in the area having relics because he had the best collection. So you would think he would be very much on the side of Catholics because, oh, he has all these saintly relics. But I mean, he's really just abusing the relics and using them to make money. So in actuality, I don't think he cared very much what religion he was looking that loyal towards, and was really just about, he was about Frederick. One of the reasons Frederick agreed to protect Luther was because Frederick was really peeved at the Holy Roman Emperor. So the Holy Roman Emperor at this time was Charles V, and let's take this time to appreciate the Habsburg chin in art. Charles V was a Habsburg. Look at that chin. Believed to be caused from inbreeding in the European Habsburg family. They have a lot of art depictions of unfortunate chins, and Charles V is not exempt from that. Poor guy. Poor guy. They really were not afraid to just show him at his worst. We will have this very nice photo of Charles V as our photo of him because I think we should just be kind to him. So Charles V, Frederick the Wise, is part of Germany, so he's part of all the little city-state nations that are under the Holy Roman Emperor, at least nominally. Frederick wanted to be the Holy Roman Emperor when there became an opening, but he didn't really have the votes. Charles V was lobbying Frederick to vote for him And if Frederick agreed, then he was going to have the majority, he would win and become Holy Roman Emperor. And in return for Frederick's vote, Charles V was going to let Frederick, he was going to set up a good marriage between their families. However, Charles V becomes Holy Roman Emperor, totally reneges on the promise, and Frederick's really mad about it. He was supposed to get an awesome marriage out of this deal where Charles got to be the emperor. He didn't get an awesome marriage, and he definitely didn't get to be Holy Roman Emperor, so he's peeved at Charles. Holy Roman Emperor is close buddies with Pope Leo, because it's the Holy Roman Emperor. Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope kind of go way back. So, because Frederick wants to stick it to the Holy Roman Emperor and he wants to stick it to the Pope, he decides he's going to shelter Luther. And that is how Luther ends up staying with Frederick the Wise and hiding out in his castle for a number of years. Okay, goodbye, Charles. There are other reasons that Frederick was on board with Luther. Luther was attacking the authority of the Pope. Frederick loved this idea. Pope is not a legitimate authority. I don't have to deal with the Pope on my back anymore. I don't have to obey a spiritual authority. Now a secular authority gets to be top dog. There's no one above me. I like that. I like that just fine. I'm on board with your new Reformation movement, Luther, as long as it means that I, the secular ruler, get to be on top. In addition, Luther thought with his Reformation and where he wanted to go with it, he wanted German nobles to take over German churches and get rid of the Catholic priests and bishops. And Frederick was also on board with that plan. He's like, you want my nobles to take over the churches? You want me to have more power? Yes, please. You may definitely hide in my castle. I like that idea a lot. You're great. So, this is huge that Frederick agrees to hide Luther, because in the past, every time you're declared a heretic, every time you're excommunicated, that means you're going to die very soon. Or you'll be a fugitive for the rest of your life, living in hiding, like in a hut somewhere in the wilderness. Luther doesn't have to hide in a hut. He's set up in a nice castle with a nobleman, a prince who's willing to lobby him and kind of bend the ear of other nobles and rulers around to be amenable to Luther's cause. So this is a really pivotal aspect of Luther's life. If Frederick had not sheltered Luther, who knows what would have happened? I mean, it's difficult to say, but it's very likely that Luther would have been apprehended and killed quite quickly. Would there have been a Reformation if Frederick hadn't sheltered him? I don't know. Probably something would have happened. But definitely Luther wouldn't have been at the head of it. So Luther goes into hiding from 1521 until 1555. He actually, he grows his hair out and grows a beard, and he calls himself George the Knight. That's his new alias, George the Knight, under Frederick the Wise. Which I get it, right? If you're going to be disguised and pretend to be someone else for the rest of your life, definitely be a knight. I would be a knight. Or warrior of whatever country I was in. Some type of warrior with authority. He eventually gets married to Catherine von Bora. She was a former nun who, after listening to Luther, left her convent. 16 years younger than him, and they had 6 children together. So, if you're ever wondering, did Luther get married? Yes, he did, and he had a lot of kids. While in hiding. So, under Prince Frederick's protection, Protestantism, in its baby form there, begins to spread and grow throughout Germany pretty rapidly. Luther is in hiding, but he's writing all the time. He's communicating with people on the outside. He's not, like, no one thinks that Luther is dead. They're aware that he's around doing things. They might have even been aware that, yeah, George the Knight, that guy is definitely Luther over in Frederick the Wise's castle. But he's under the protection of a ruler. It's not like he's just over in some peasant's barn hiding out. He's under the protection of a guy who has authority and weapons and armies. So nobody's about to storm the castle of Frederick to try to grab George the Knight. So he still has a good amount of influence, and he's guiding, shaping the Reformation as much as he can. Unfortunately, there's only so much you can do when you are stuck in a castle all the time. And Luther quickly became a little bit distraught because he realized, I've started something that I can't control. The Reformation, as it grows and gathers steams, starts going in all different directions. And I mean, that's what we'll be talking about for pretty much all of July, all the crazy different directions that the Reformation goes in, and how varied the different Reformation movements looked. The printing press was a huge reason for the quick expansion of open dissent against the Roman Catholic Church. Production of pamphlets, publications skyrocketed extremely quickly. So people had access to all of this printed material, even if they didn't have access to the actual Reformation leader himself speaking in front of them in person. They had all of his writings. And thanks to the push from the humanist movement, that resulted in an increase in literacy, an increase in people wanting to educate themselves and learn, there were a lot more people reading. What a break. Okay, so I want to take a little bit of time, because I think it's really interesting, to look at some of the satirical cartoons and images that were used during this time period as a sort of argumentative tool by both Protestants and Catholics. Just like today, where the media simplifies an issue and creates caricatures to polarize people and persuade people, writers did the same thing using the printing press during the time of the Reformation. There was a lot of terms like fat monks and horned bishops, a lot of speaking of the Pope or Rome as the Antichrist, or speaking of Luther as the Antichrist, a lot of Antichrist language going on. And a lot of these, like some of it was in words. They'd use a lot of foul language when talking about anyone who was a cleric, a lot of defecation language. I don't know how to say it more than that. Luther himself talked a lot about flatulence and defecation. You read some of that, and he had a very crude sense of humor. But anyways, I digress. I want to look at some of these satirical cartoons because I think they're really interesting. So the first two that I have come from a pretty well-known series at the time that was released, and they're meant to draw a strong contrast between Christ and the Roman hierarchy. So you see in this image on the left over here, an image of Christ driving moneylenders from the temple. So he's driving out people who are just trying to make money from his church. And then over here on the right, the artist, who is clearly a Protestant sympathizer, we have a depiction of the Pope, who's just counting money and getting money and collecting money. And by putting these two images together, you get this strong contrast of Christ is about, he's not all about money. He wants to get money collecting and just making a profit away from his church. And over here, we're making it seem like the Pope is the Antichrist because he's collecting money. A second one in this same collection, it's doing the same thing. On the left side, we have Christ washing the feet of his disciples. And on the right side, you can see above it says Antichristi. There is the Pope having his feet being kissed by people who come to see him. Again, trying to draw that really strong contrast, saying, this is what Christ is actually like. This is the Pope twisting Christ and being all antichristy. Okay. This is a satire mocking Catholic theologians. So the cartoon depicts Catholic opponents of Luther as beasts. So it's meant to dehumanize opponents of Luther. From the left, you see Thomas Murner as a cat. Murr was the German equivalent of meow, so he's made into a cat. They're making fun of his name. Hieronymus Empser is a goat. Empser's family coat of arms was a goat. Pope Leo is in the middle there, and he's depicted as a savage lion. Johann Eck is the pig over there. That's our buddy Eck, which is just simply meant to demean. It's never a compliment when you're depicted as a pig. And then lastly, you have a man named Jacob Lemp as a dog, which was also just meant to demean and dehumanize and make fun of people. It's an interesting way of attacking people's points by just attacking the person themselves. So classic ad hominem. A lot of satire is just ad hominems. And then lastly, we have two examples of painting people as the Antichrist. So on the right, we have a Protestant character depicting the Pope as the seven-headed Antichrist. And on the right, we have a character of Luther as the seven-headed Antichrist. So these were very popular at that time for the people who couldn't read or maybe didn't want to sit down and read a bunch of sort of complicated pamphlets. These were very effective ways of communicating a simple idea. Pope bad, hierarchy gross, hierarchy Antichrist, Luther bad, Luther stupid, Luther Antichrist. Really simple messages conveyed in, very demeaning ways. There were some really rough satirical images of monks that are kind of just too inappropriate that I didn't want to show them. Yeah. So that was a very popular thing. Where am I in my notes here? Gotta get back. Okay, so Luther is in hiding with Frederick. He sees himself as beset by enemies on all sides. On the state side, Luther, yes, he's protected by Frederick, but he's also very aware that there are entire countries like France or Spain that are out to get him and would love to get their hands on him, not to mention the Holy Roman Emperor. So he does not feel that safe. Like, he's safe, but also there are an awful lot of people who want to kill him. He's as safe as he can feel, knowing that the entirety of Christendom is out looking to kill him. From the Catholic Church, Luther considered the Pope to be the puppet of the devil. And as I said before, he's a very spiritual guy in that he wrote still that demons were plaguing him constantly. So it wasn't just, oh yeah, the Pope, he's like the Antichrist. That wasn't just a jab for him. That was like, the Pope is being controlled by the devil. The devil is truly controlling the Pope. And that's scary. I mean, if you really believe that, that's terrifying. The Pope was a very powerful dude. And if you think he's the puppet of the devil, that might be something that keeps you up at night. And then if you think demons are tormenting you, which I don't know Luther's life, demons very well could have been tormenting him constantly. He was not at peace. He was not at peace. From the Reformer side, too, Luther was just overwhelmed by the amount of new leaders that were popping up. They were taking his Reformation, taking his ideas, his 95 Theses, and just going in all different directions with it. They were doing a lot of things that he didn't necessarily agree with at all. It was very difficult for him to distinguish between collaborators and competitors during those years. So yeah, he started a movement, but now he can't control it. He's set something on fire and he cannot control that fire. It's going to go where it's going to go now. We have one example that I want to talk about with a guy named Andreas Bodenstein von Karlstadt. And this is Karlstadt. I'm gonna make that a little bit bigger. Karlstadt. He was a buddy of Luther's, especially from his debating days. So they were really contemporaries and colleagues between 1517 and 1521. When Luther went into hiding, Karlstadt is like, all right, this is my time. I got to take on the mantle now. Luther was my friend. I need to continue on his work. I'm like his person in the field. So he started getting very active. Karlstadt felt that matter and spirit were so radically different from one another that they were utterly incompatible. And this is going to be a theme that we see again in the Reformation a number of times. This idea of spirit is so utterly different, utterly transcendent, that we cannot have physical things in our worship of the spiritual. We cannot have the material in our churches because it is just utterly different. It's not godly at all. It's repugnant to have that in our worship. When we are trying to lift our eyes to heaven, we don't want to have the material. It's icky, gross. There's too much of a vast difference between the two. And he differed from Luther in that he had the belief that the Eucharist was more of a spiritual sign, and so therefore the Mass could not be a sacrifice. This makes sense that he thought that the Eucharist was just a kind of spiritual symbol, because if you're a guy who believes that spirit and matter is utterly different, they need to be super far away from one another. The idea of the Eucharist, Christ present in a host, that's totally antithetical to what you believe in. That's absolutely not. Definitely going to reject that belief. It's the opposite of what you think. So he's like, no, Eucharist is a symbol. It's definitely not actually the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ. Karlstadt is kind of one of the first people to promulgate that belief, because that is not what Luther thought at first. Because of his passionate stance against material objects in spiritual worship, he was really against sacred symbols, any sacred materials. He was against the sacraments, because again, that's combining a material sign with a spiritual grace. So he doesn't like that. We don't want to have material and spiritual combined. He was against sacred imagery, vestments, relics, and he thought the Mass was too material. He was also against clerical celibacy, because he thought that was too much of a combining of a physical mortification to help one grow spiritually. Again, he doesn't want to have any of that kind of connection. No connection between physical and spiritual. He pushes for social reform, egalitarianism, shared property, along with shared priesthood. So it's really interesting when we look at the Reformation, we're going to see kind of proto-communist, proto-Marxist ideologies. Later, when we talk about some more radical movements in the Reformation, there are some historians that have argued that these movements were really the first examples of Marxist ideology. So Marx wasn't anything new. He was kind of just a reiteration of something that had been seen in the Reformation. So Karlstadt, he's all about social reform. He had a lot of good things to say about egalitarianism. He said everyone's equal, everyone's the same, women, children, men, like all people are equal. And then shared property. In February of 1522 in Wittenberg, where Karlstadt worked in Wittenberg, he kind of incited a mob that arose and stormed the churches, destroying all sacred imagery and art and anything material that was in the church that was associated with worship. At this point, Frederick the Wise, who's the ruler over all of this, he's nervous. First of all, this guy Karlstadt is saying that everyone's equal, and Frederick is not on board with that, because Frederick is a ruler and he is most certainly not equal with those peasants. He's better than them. And please, sir, stop telling peasants that they're as good as me, because they are not, and they need to know their place. So Frederick doesn't like Karlstadt for those political reasons, And then he also doesn't like Karlstadt because Frederick has a lot of relics. He's a relic guy. He likes this sacred imagery, sacred stuff. He's not okay with them being destroyed like that. And also the idea of shared property, he was not on board with. It's like, no, I'm a ruler, I am rich, I keep my things, and you get none of my things. So Karlstadt really was a threat to the social hierarchy, political hierarchy, so he could not be tolerated. And quickly, Frederick came onto the scene, said, absolutely not, immediately halted everything, and prohibited Karlstadt from continuing in the ideas that he was preaching. Luther briefly popped out of hiding on March 6th, 1522, to calm everyone down, re-legitimize all the old symbols and old rituals. And he had some angry sermons, angry words to say against Karlstadt, saying that Karlstadt had become too focused on obedience to the law, which was the exact thing that Luther was trying to get away from. Luther wants to distance himself, wants to distance Christianity from this idea that I need to do the things to be good. It was that idea that tormented him as a monk and drove him to intense scrupulosity and misery. He doesn't like, I need to do the things to be good. In Karlstadt, he sees the exact same thing. He says, you're just doing the same kind of legalism that I hated in Catholicism, but you're being legalistic about different things. Now you're saying, we need to have no sacred art to be good. We have to get rid of all the material things to be good. We need to have no vestments to be good. So Luther came on really strong against Karlstadt and said, yes, we were friends once, but now you've gone crazy. And stop it with these ideas right now because you're taking us in the total wrong direction. Comes out strong against Karlstadt, and then he has to go back into hiding, back hanging out with Frederick the Wise. But as the Reformation continues, Luther can't continually do this. He can't keep popping up saying, no. I didn't mean it for the Reformation to go in this direction. Don't listen to this guy. He's actually going wrong. He can't just correct everyone who's a Reformation leader that's taking his ideas and going in a direction that he didn't want them to go in. Partly because he himself said any Christian who knows and has the Bible has more authority than any pope or council. They have the authority. If you're a Christian, you have the Bible and you know the Bible, then you are the ultimate authority. Now, you can make arguments that some people knew the Bible more than others. And there was many arguments about that. But Luther's Reformation had a real problem with authority in that there was no authority. So it ends up splintering and going into all these different directions, which Luther can't control. One last thing I want to note is Luther's a really practical guy. He wants his Reformation to be successful. And he's very aware that we can't go too fast, too soon. So when Karlstadt starts talking about egalitarianism and shared property and everyone's equal and the rulers don't really have any right to rule, Luther is like, shh, that is not going to fly with the rulers. And the political rulers have to be on our side if we want this Reformation to be at all successful. So Luther is always going to be against anyone who's being too radical because he's like, do you want the king or local nobleman to come chop your head off? Well then, don't say anything that is going to put the king or nobleman or duke or whoever's position in jeopardy. So he's really about being cautious and practical and not upsetting the political powers that be, because the political powers that be are the only ones keeping the reformers from being apprehended and killed by the Catholic political powers that be. So you have to keep the the politicians that are on your side, you want to keep them on your side because it's kind of a life or death situation. All right. I'm going to drink water for any questions. Okay. Well, that's all for tonight. Next week, we're talking about Thomas Müntzer, who goes in the same way as Karlstadt, but even more radical, and it ends very bloody. Until then, I hope you guys have a great week, and yeah, see you next week. Thanks for tuning in.